My name's Ely, I am 34 years old, and I suppose you could aptly describe my lifelong role within my family as the responsible sibling. Not the cherished favorite, nor the rebellious firebrand, and certainly not the golden child bathed in effulgent praise. I was simply the dependable one. The sibling who consistently arrived punctually, managed their finances diligently, and unfailingly remembered every single birthday, anniversary, and minor family milestone. My professional life revolves around the intricate world of finance, a domain where precision and predictability reign supreme. I live alone, in a quiet apartment meticulously maintained, and I tend to approach life with a detached practicality, rarely succumbing to grand displays of emotion or making a fuss about anything trivial or profound. My family, on the other hand, operates on an entirely different frequency. They are a boisterous, effusive, and outwardly close, knit unit, their bonds often expressed in a performative, almost theatrical manner. They possess an uncanny knack for projecting an image of unblemished domestic bliss, effortlessly sweeping any genuine, festering problems under a thick, ornate rug of denial and forced cheer. Throughout my life, I've always felt somewhat adjacent to their vibrant core, involved, yes, always present at gatherings, but never truly embraced in the way one might cherish a central, indispensable member. I was the quintessential wedding guest, invited out of obligation, perhaps, but never once asked to stand amongst the smiling faces captured in the official photographs. An observer, a quiet attendee, ever on the periphery of their bustling, self-absorbed universe. Growing up, the undisputed star of our familial constellation was my younger brother Mason. He was a force of nature, radiating an almost intoxicating charisma, utterly reckless in his pursuits, and perpetually entangled in some new, spectacular form of trouble. Yet, with an almost infuriating consistency, he always landed on his feet. He possessed this infuriatingly smug charm, a sort of roguish twinkle in his eye, which our parents devoured like the sweetest confection. It didn't matter that he summarily dropped out of college barely a year in, blew through 2 successive entry-level jobs with remarkable speed, and eventually, at the ripe old age of 28, found himself back home, living in his childhood bedroom. They defended him with a fervent, almost religious zeal, as if he were the second coming of some brilliant, misunderstood genius, perhaps Einstein himself, unfairly maligned by a world too mundane to appreciate his unique spark. My own trajectory stood in stark contrast. I meticulously paid my way through every year of college, working through nights and weekends. I secured a steady job in finance immediately after graduation, and have held the same position for over a decade, quietly climbing the corporate ladder. When my father's hours were drastically cut during an economic downturn, I stepped in without a word, helping to cover a significant portion of their mortgage payments. I never once sought recognition or commendation for any of these quiet contributions. Yet, despite my unwavering reliability and tangible support, none of it ever seemed to truly register. At least not enough to earn me a coveted seat at the metaphorical head of our family's elaborate dining table. I remained the dependable, invisible scaffolding, perpetually holding up the structure from the shadows. Still, for the longest time, I steadfastly refused to let it gnaw at me. Or so I tirelessly convinced myself. I kept my head down, sending the necessary checks, replying promptly to their often perfunctory texts, showing up without fail for every holiday gathering, and smiling dutifully through the barrage of small, insidious jabs that always, without exception, came cunningly disguised as affectionate jokes.
Ely, you're just so serious! Loosen up, man, it's just a party!
Or, with feigned surprise, "Oh, we figured you'd be too busy. You're always working, aren't you?" Each remark, a tiny, barbed arrow, lightly pricking at the skin, intended to remind me of my supposed rigidity, my perceived lack of spontaneity, my perpetual outsider status. I took it all in stride, absorbing the blows with a practiced stoicism. I suppose, deep down, a persistent, unyielding part of me harbored the foolish hope that if I just kept showing up, if I continued to be the quiet, consistent presence, one day, I would finally be seen as a true, integral part of the family, and not merely the anonymous financial underwriter, supporting their theatrical charade from the background. That fragile, carefully constructed illusion, however, shattered with a deafening crash last fall. It began innocently enough, with a dinner invitation. Mason had recently become engaged to a woman named Brooke, whom my mother, with her characteristic hyperbole, had already christened an absolute angel, a veritable saint descended from the heavens. My parents, swept up in the celebratory fervor, decided to host a grand engagement dinner at an extravagantly swanky rooftop restaurant nestled amidst the glittering skyscrapers downtown. It was precisely the kind of establishment they could never ordinarily afford, a detail which, in hindsight, should have immediately served as a glaring red flag, a neon sign blinking an ominous warning. I received a call from my mother a few weeks prior to the event. "Ely, sweetheart," she cooed, her voice dripping with that cloying, syrupy sweetness she invariably adopted when she desired something from me, her tone a transparent veil over her true intentions. "We would absolutely adore it if you could make it to Mason and Brooke's engagement dinner. It's going to be such a special night, a truly unforgettable occasion." "Of course," I replied without a moment's hesitation, my automatic compliance a well-worn habit. "Just send me the details. And if it's not too much trouble," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if sharing a delicate secret. "We were hoping you might be able to help us with the reservation. Just to hold it, with your card. We'll pay you back, obviously, dearest." I should have known then, in that precise moment, that the phrase, "we'll pay you back," was merely a euphemism, an elaborate verbal charade that inevitably translated to, "You will never, under any circumstances, see a single penny of that money again." But, like always, I acquiesced. I called the restaurant, navigating their labyrinthine booking system, securing a private space grand enough to comfortably accommodate 20 people, and provided them with my credit card details for the hefty deposit. I genuinely didn't mind. Not truly. It was Mason's night, after all, a landmark moment in his chaotic life. And maybe, just maybe, this time, I would finally feel as though I was genuinely, unequivocally a part of it, not just a funding mechanism. A fleeting, foolish hope, perhaps, but a hope nonetheless. The night of the dinner arrived crisp and expectant. I showed up right on time, precisely 7 o'clock sharp, a punctuality ingrained in my very being. I was dressed impeccably in a dark navy suit, its fabric crisp and uncreased, a freshly pressed white shirt, and a gleaming new pair of cufflinks I had been saving for a special occasion. I carried with me a truly excellent bottle of vintage champagne, chosen with careful consideration for the engaged couple, and even brought a custom printed card, elegantly embossed with their intertwined initials, a small, personal touch I hoped would convey my genuine well wishes. As I stepped onto the expansive rooftop, the hostess, a sleek woman with an air of professional detachment, offered me a small, almost imperceptible nod and gestured gracefully toward the private section reserved for our party. I took a deep, fortifying breath, a quiet preparation for what I hoped would be a welcoming embrace, and walked in. The space was undeniably beautiful, a vision of understated elegance. Delicate string lights twinkled overhead like scattered stars, casting a soft, warm glow. Ornate floral centerpieces adorned each table, their blossoms a vibrant burst of color and fragrance. In a far corner, a soft jazz band played, their melodies a gentle, unobtrusive hum that filled the air. And there they all were. My parents, Mason, Brooke, her entire extended family, and a scattering of their closest friends. Everyone already held drinks in hand, their laughter echoing lightly against the glass walls, their voices a cheerful murmur, glasses clinking in a symphony of celebration. I smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile, and walked over, expecting, at the very least, a small nod of recognition, a brief moment of warmth. Instead, Mason turned to me, that familiar, infuriatingly smug grin plastered across his face. "Oh hey," he drawled, his gaze barely flickering toward the expensive champagne bottle clutched in my hand. "Glad you made it, man." Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he pointed toward a flimsy, fold-out chair that had been unceremoniously set off to the side, distinctly apart from the main table. It was next to a trash bin, no less, its metallic gleam a stark, humiliating contrast to the elegant setting. "Sorry, this table's for family only," he announced, his voice laced with a sickly sweet, mock sympathy, the words a carefully delivered punch. "But there's a spot for you right over there." I actually blinked. My mind, in a desperate attempt to protect itself, immediately assumed he was joking. It had to be a joke, a poorly timed, tasteless prank, but a joke nonetheless. I looked to our mother, seeking reassurance, a signal, any indication that this was not real. She simply offered me that tight-lipped, almost pained smile she reserved for moments when she desperately wished to remain uninvolved, to be a passive observer rather than a participant in any uncomfortable scene. My father chuckled awkwardly, a hollow, nervous sound, and raised his glass in a vague, dismissive gesture. Brooke, Mason's angelic fiancée, didn't even bother to look up from her conversation, and then, as if on some prearranged cue, a few people at the table, probably Mason's friends, began to laugh. They actually laughed. I stood there for a second too long, paralyzed, exposed. I wanted to say something, anything, a scathing retort, a desperate question, a cry of outrage. But my throat suddenly closed up, a dry, constricted knot of humiliation. My ears burned hot, a furious flush creeping up my neck. I felt a visceral regression, as if I were 13 years old again, standing awkwardly on the fringes of a family gathering, deliberately left out of a cousin's wedding group photo, because, as I was later told, I simply didn't fit the aesthetic. The memory, sharp and stinging, ignited a familiar shame. So, I simply walked to the solitary chair, placed my expensive bottle of champagne beside me on the cold floor, and sat down utterly alone. I didn't even bother to take my coat off, as if keeping it on would offer some thin, fragile layer of protection from the raw, exposed vulnerability I felt. A waiter, noticing my isolated presence, eventually came by and asked, quietly, if I was with the party. I nodded silently, unable to trust my voice. He didn't press for more information, didn't offer further inquiry. He simply handed me a glass of water, its coolness a stark contrast to the heat in my ears, and moved on, blending back into the bustling rhythm of the restaurant. I sat there, a silent, solitary sentinel, for almost 2 agonizing hours. I watched them laugh, their joyous sounds like a foreign language to my ears. I watched them raise their glasses in triumphant toasts, their faces alight with unburdened merriment. I watched them unwrap gifts with exclamations of delight, the rustle of wrapping paper like a mocking whisper. I observed my brother, Mason, stand and deliver a long, rambling speech, his voice swelling with self-importance, about how incredibly lucky he was to be surrounded by his closest people, his cherished inner circle. I watched my mother openly tear up, her face a mask of sentimental adoration, when Brooke, with an almost practiced sincerity, called her the best future mother-in-law a girl could ever ask for. Not a single person, not one, even bothered to ask if I wanted to order anything, if I needed a drink, if I existed beyond the silent, excluded figure next to the bin. Eventually, dessert arrived, a towering, elaborate layered cake adorned with delicate edible gold flakes, a shimmering testament to their indulgence. The jazz band in the corner shifted to a slow, melancholic tune, its notes mirroring the quiet ache in my chest. Outside, the sun dipped gracefully below the sharp, glittering skyline, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. And it was then, watching the last slivers of daylight disappear, that a chilling realization settled over me with the weight of a physical burden. Not a single person at that entire table had looked in my direction for the past 30 minutes. I was truly, utterly invisible. Then, the moment of truth arrived. The check. I watched the waiter, a figure of impending consequence, walk toward their table, holding the small, dark leather folder like a sacred artifact. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the boisterous group, then, with a subtle shift, glanced down at the credit card on file, the card he was clearly instructed to use. My card. I watched him take a few deliberate steps toward me, his movements suddenly heavy with meaning. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice quiet, almost deferential, as if recognizing the delicate tension in the air. "The total for the event is $3,218. Should I run the same card for the final amount?" Every single person at the main table, as if synchronized by an invisible conductor, turned to look. The laughter died, conversations evaporated. My brother Mason raised an eyebrow, a flicker of mild surprise, but quickly recovered, a casual, almost arrogant dismissiveness in his voice. "Oh yeah," he said, as if confirming an obvious, pre-arranged detail. "He's got it." The waiter, now visibly uncomfortable, looked from Mason to me, a silent question in his eyes, and I smiled. Not a forced, polite smile nor a nervous one. It was a calm, slow, measured smile, almost imperceptibly widening, as if I were finally in on a private joke only I understood. My voice, when it came, was steady, remarkably clear, devoid of any tremor of anger or humiliation. "Not my table," I said, just loud enough for every single person to hear, the words cutting through the sudden, thick silence like a razor. I was told this was for family only. There was a silence then, so sharp, so absolute, it felt as if the very air had been cleaved in half. My brother's mouth, which had been preparing to utter some glib remark, opened slightly, then froze, a fish out of water. My mother's brow furrowed, a confused frown replacing her earlier sentimental expression. My father, usually a slouching figure of comfortable indifference, suddenly sat straighter in his seat, as if an invisible wire had pulled him taut. Brooke's father, a stiff, imposing man in a pristine blazer, who had barely uttered a word all night, furrowed his own brow, his gaze sharpening with an almost predatory intensity. The waiter hesitated, caught in the crossfire of unspoken family drama. "Sir, you made the reservation," he ventured, his voice barely a whisper. "I did," I confirmed, nodding slowly, my gaze fixed on him, my resolve unwavering. "And I paid the deposit. But I'm not with them." I gestured toward the main table with a slight tilt of my head. "I'm over here?" I paused, then slowly, deliberately, I stood up from my isolated chair, picked up my coat, and with a pointed nod toward the trash can beside me, added, "At the side table, where I belong, apparently." You could almost hear the collective thud of jaws hitting the floor, a soundless impact of shock and dawning realization. For a long second, nobody moved, frozen in a tableau of disbelief. The waiter stood awkwardly between the two tables, holding the bill folder as if it were a radioactive device, uncertain where to place it. My brother looked as though someone had just slapped him across the face with a wet fish, his smug expression utterly shattered, replaced by a ghastly pallor. My mother's eyes narrowed, flickering frantically between my composed face and the expensive check, her mind working furiously, desperately trying to comprehend how this meticulously orchestrated narrative had so spectacularly unraveled. How control had slipped from her grasp so swiftly. "Wed a lie," she finally managed, her voice low, a thin thread of barely concealed panic woven through its usual syrupy tone. "What are you doing?" I simply shrugged, a gesture of casual indifference that masked the storm within me. following the seating chart mom. Mason said this table was for family only. I assumed that meant I wasn't included. I then turned my gaze back to the beleaguered waiter, my voice clear and firm. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I wasn't welcome. I paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. So, I won't be paying.
Don't be ridiculous.
Mason snapped, the last vestiges of his smirk finally cracking into something uglier, a mask of unadulterated fury.
It's just a joke, man. Lighten up. You always take things so personally.
The entire room had gone quiet, the festive hum replaced by a stifling tension. Even the jazz band, sensing the palpable shift in atmosphere, seemed to be winding down to an awkward, almost apologetic hum. All eyes were fixed on me, a spotlight I had always dreaded. But for the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking beneath their collective gaze. I wasn't cowering, wasn't folding in on myself. A new, unfamiliar strength bloomed in my chest. Yeah, I said slowly, deliberately, drawing out the words, letting them resonate with quiet power. That's the problem, Mason. You think everything's a joke. As long as it's at someone else's expense, it's always just a joke. Brooke, caught in the sudden, raw authenticity of the moment, looked genuinely confused, as if she were only just now catching on that something real, something truly significant and deeply unsettling, was unfolding before her eyes. Her father, the stiff man in the blazer who had been so taciturn all night, gave Mason a sharp, piercing look that spoke volumes. To invite this man to your engagement dinner, he stated, his voice surprisingly deep and resonating with incredulous indignation, and then set him next to the trash can. A Mason scoffed, a desperate, fading attempt to regain his composure, and looked instinctively to my mother for backup, for validation, for the usual protective shield she always deployed. She straightened in her seat, a brittle, strained smile plastered across her face. Let's not blow things out of proportion, Mr. Whittaker. Eli's just being dramatic. He's always been sensitive, you know. I almost laughed then, a bitter, hollow sound that caught in my throat. That was her go-to line, wasn't it? Always had been. He's just sensitive.
He's just tired.
He's just overreacting. Any flimsy excuse, any convenient deflection, to avoid admitting that something genuinely cruel had occurred. That they had orchestrated it, and that they had stood idly by, allowing it to happen without intervention or remorse. It was easier to pathologize me than to face their own complicity. The waiter, ever the professional caught in an increasingly untenable situation, cleared his throat delicately. I'm sorry to interrupt again, he murmured, his voice laced with genuine discomfort. But the restaurant needs to process the bill before we close the tab on the private space. If the card on file won't be used, I'll need an alternate form of payment. Silence descended once more, heavy and suffocating. I turned, my back to their table, and started to walk toward the elevator, the quiet click of my shoes on the polished floor, the only sound in the tense room. That's when my dad finally spoke, his voice surprisingly firm, cutting through the silence.
Eli, come on,
he urged, a note of exasperation creeping into his tone. You've already paid for half. You might as well just finish it. I stopped cold. That single sentence, that casually dismissive, might as well, snapped something crucial inside me, a final, frayed thread of patience and self-denial. I turned back slowly, my gaze sweeping across their faces, no longer seeking their approval, but delivering a quiet, devastating judgment. You're right, Dad, I said, my voice dangerously calm, the words precise and deliberate. I did pay the deposit. But let's be more specific, shall we? I took a step closer, then another, until I was standing just a few feet from their table, my presence a stark, unyielding force. I lowered my voice, but not enough to be missed, ensuring every word resonated clearly through the quieted room. I even called 3 separate restaurants, negotiating and comparing, just to find one with the exact rooftop view that Mason insisted upon. The view, he said, was non-negotiable for his perfect night. I painstakingly picked the date around his incredibly demanding football schedule, rearranging my own significant work commitments to accommodate him. I personally ordered custom floral arrangements, expensive and handcrafted, because Mom emphatically stated that fake flowers would look cheap in the photos and embarrass them. I paid the $500 non-refundable deposit without so much as blinking, knowing full well it was a sunk cost. And I showed up on time, alone in a suit, with a heartfelt gift, specifically to support my brother and be there for his big night. My voice, though low, carried an undeniable weight. I looked directly at Mason, then swept my gaze across my parents, then back to him. And what, I asked, each word a hammer blow, did I get in return? A folding chair next to a garbage bin and a casual, dismissive sorry. Family only, from the very person I went above and beyond for. I turned back to Mason, letting the full force of my gaze settle on him. His face was flushed now, a deep, angry red creeping up his neck and over his ears. He stood up abruptly, attempting to puff himself up, to project an image of indignant authority, but it only made him look more ridiculous, like a child throwing a tantrum. "You're making a scene," he blustered, his voice cracking with thinly veiled rage. "No," I corrected him, my voice unwavering, my resolve hardening into steel. "I'm drawing a line." And with that, I turned and walked away. I didn't even bother with the elevator. Its slow, mechanical ascent a symbol of the time I no longer had for their games. I took the stairs, two at a time, every step pounding with a wild surge of adrenaline and a liberating, almost intoxicating disbelief that I had actually, finally done it. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a slap, sharp and bracing, a welcome shock to my system. I loosened my tie, pulling the suffocating knot away from my throat, and kept walking, faster now, a man liberated. I didn't know where I was going, not precisely, but one thing was abundantly clear: I wasn't going back. Not to that table, not to that dynamic, not to that life. I thought, perhaps, that would be the end of it. A bold exit, a dramatic mic drop. Maybe a few awkward, half-hearted apologies would follow, an insincere attempt to brush the entire incident under the ever-present rug, another inconvenient truth to be ignored. But what I, in my naive hope for a quick resolution, didn't know was just how deep the consequences of that single, decisive moment would truly go. Because later that night, long after I had returned to my quiet apartment, still in my suit, still clutching that unopened, now heavy bottle of champagne like a phantom limb, my phone lit up. First, a text from Mason, predictably lacking any hint of remorse. "Dude, seriously, you couldn't have just paid the check and talked to me after."
What was that about?
Then another, almost immediately, from my mother, a text laced with fury and self-pity. "A lie? You embarrassed us in front of Brooke's entire family! Was that your goal? Revenge." Her self-victimization was as predictable as the sunrise. And then a call, from an unknown number. "It was Brooke," she said, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of its usual cheerful veneer, tinged with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "I know we don't really talk, but can I ask you something?" "Sure," I replied cautiously, my mind still reeling from the evening's events. "Did you really pay for everything? The deposit, the flowers, all of it?" I paused, the weight of the question hanging in the air.
"Yeah."
I confirmed a simple, unadorned truth. There was a long silence on the other end, punctuated only by the faint hum of the phone. Then her voice, barely above a whisper, delivered a bombshell. "They told my dad you offered to. That it was your idea. A kind gesture." That stopped me cold. A fresh wave of disbelief washed over me, colder than the night air. "I never offered," I stated slowly, carefully letting the words sink in. "They asked. I said yes. I didn't expect anything back. No grand repayment, no public display of gratitude. But I definitely didn't do it for show, or as some altruistic volunteering of my funds. Brooke sighed, a wary, heavy sound. Well, my dad's furious. Absolutely livid. He thought you volunteered as a kind gesture, being a part of the family. But now he's saying he never would have agreed to such an expensive restaurant if he'd known it was being paid for by someone they basically shoved in the corner. Another pause, a moment of uncomfortable reflection. He said, Mason, and your parents made him look like a fool. A complete idiot, she quickly added, as if to distance herself from the brewing storm. I'm not calling to get involved in your family drama, Eli. I just thought you should know. I thanked her, a simple, automatic courtesy, and we hung up. But the true fallout, the cascading ripple effects of that night, had only just begun. Over the next few days, things escalated with a breathtaking velocity, and in a manner my family had clearly not anticipated. It began, predictably, with the family group chat. You know, the one, that sprawling digital thread that usually only lit up around birthdays and holidays with recycled memes, blurry food pictures, and generic "Happy Friday!" texts from my aunt. I hadn't heard a peep from it since the night of the dinner, but suddenly it roared back to life, a digital cacophony of frantic, accusatory messages. Mom, we need to talk. Call me when you have a minute. This is serious. Mason, bro, you seriously messed things up with Brooke's family. You owe us a fix.
No boo.
Ely, this is getting out of hand. Just apologize and let's move on. Don't make this worse. I didn't reply. Not to a single one. It wasn't just about the chair anymore. It wasn't even primarily about the $3,000 bill they tried to stick me with. It was about everything that came before it. The cumulative weight of years. Years of being treated like an emergency contact, a convenient designated driver, a readily accessible, bottomless backup wallet. And now, for the first time, when I had finally, unequivocally, said no, they simply didn't know what to do with me. Their meticulously constructed house of cards, built on my silent compliance, was teetering precariously. What made it worse, or perhaps, paradoxically, better, depending on one's perspective, was the unwavering resolve of Brooke's father, Mr. Whitaker. He was clearly not the type to take public humiliation lightly. From what I gathered through a mutual friend of Mason's, a surprisingly decent guy named Trent, who had always treated me with more respect than most of Mason's circle, Mr. Whitaker had had an absolute meltdown the night after the dinner. He had, Trent explained, meticulously paid for Brooke's private schooling, invested heavily in helping her launch her successful marketing firm, and had apparently gone to extraordinary lengths to plan a smooth, elegant, and perfectly respectable engagement season. To discover that the groom's side had not only brazenly lied about who was footing the bill for the venue, but had also treated their own flesh and blood like a piece of trash, and then, to add insult to injury, stuck him with half the drinks tab. After I refused to pay the rest, it was, for him, an unforgivable breach of etiquette and principle. According to Trent, Brooke's dad had delivered a scathing pronouncement over brunch the very next day, his voice cutting through the Sunday morning quiet. If this is how they treat their own blood, what? He had reportedly declared, slamming his hand on the table, happens when you actually marry into it. What kind of family is this, Mason? Ouch. The ripple effects of that single, cutting line hit Mason like a freight train. Suddenly, all wedding planning was abruptly paused. Brooke had retreated to her own condo for a mental reset. The once vibrant Pinterest boards, dedicated to wedding themes, mysteriously vanishing from the digital ether. My mother, ever the master of damage control, deployed her signature weapon, along meticulously crafted email. Not a terse text, not a rushed voicemail. An actual formal email, The subject line a single plaintive word. Please. The body of the email itself was a 5-paragraph masterpiece of sugar-coated manipulation, dripping with feigned innocence and crocodile tears. It was all about how she never meant to hurt me, how she never realized I felt excluded, and how it would mean so very much to the family if I would just be willing to sit down with Mason and smooth things over. But nowhere, not once in that entire sprawling missive, was the singular, crucial word, sorry. Just, we didn't realize. You misunderstood. Let's not let one silly night destroy the bond we've built. I stared at that last line for a long time, the words swirling in my mind, mocking me. What bond exactly? Was it the bond where I drove 3 hours on Christmas Eve, through a blizzard to deliver gifts because Mom declared Mason wasn't in the right headspace to shop for anyone? Or perhaps the bond where I canceled a long-planned, much-anticipated trip to Spain 2 years ago because Dad needed unexpected surgery, and they claimed they didn't have the money for a home nurse to assist him during recovery. Or was it the unbreakable bond where I signed the loan on their second car, without even being asked twice, a car that Mason then borrowed indefinitely and never bothered to return? The same car, I suddenly realized, that he was likely still driving. I let the email sit in my inbox, unreplied to, a silent rejection. 2 days later, my Aunt Karen, my mother's older sister, called me. That truly surprised me. Aunt Karen wasn't exactly known for her warmth and fuzzy affection. She was sharp, a no-nonsense businesswoman who ran her own successful interior design firm, always carrying an air of barely concealed judgment, her eyes missing nothing. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year. Eli, she said, her voice brisk, cutting straight to the chase. I heard about the dinner. Of course you did, I replied, trying my best to keep the sarcasm from completely dripping from my voice. I'm not calling to scold you, she stated quickly, sensing my defensiveness. I just want to say good, about time someone shook the tree. That caught me completely off guard. I paused, genuinely stunned. Excuse me. As she sighed, a weary but resigned sound. Look, I know how your parents are, always brushing things under the rug, always pretending things are perfect, even when they're crumbling. But they've leaned on you too much, Eli. For too long. And Mason. He's always gotten away with treating you like some kind of side character, a convenient plot device in his own self-centered narrative. I appreciate that, Aunt Karen, I said quietly, the words feeling foreign, unaccustomed to such open validation. But why now? Why are you saying this now? Because now the Whittakers are involved, she said, her voice dry, almost amused. And your mom's panicking. She called me yesterday frantic, asked if I'd be willing to talk some sense into you. I raised an eyebrow, a ghost of a smile playing on my lips. And what did you say? I told her you didn't need sense. Aunt Karen replied, her voice firm, unwavering. You needed space. And that maybe it's time they finally learned how to function as adults without using you as scaffolding for their own dysfunctional lives. That was the first time, truly the very first time in my entire life, that I felt like someone in my family actually saw me. Not as a walking, talking checkbook, not as a convenient punching bag for their frustrations, just as a person, as Eli. The recognition, simple as it was, resonated deep within me, a quiet revolution. Later that night, I received another text. This time it was from Mason. Brooke's dad just canceled the deposit on the wedding venue. Said we're not aligned in values. Fetch eyes. Not, can you help me? Not, I'm sorry for what I did. Not even a hint of humility. Just a blunt, entitled command. Fix this. And that's when it hit me, with the force of an epiphany. He still didn't get it. He still thought I was a tool in his personal toolbox. A convenient pressure valve. A wallet with a heartbeat. So I decided to finally fix something. but not in the way he meant. That night, with a calm resolve I hadn't known I possessed, I logged into the shared online account I'd set up for him a year ago. It was the account Mason had used temporarily while he was unemployed, the one he never quite got around to closing. The one he'd linked his gym membership and Spotify subscriptions to, using it like a personal slush fund. And I quietly, meticulously, moved the remaining funds, not much, just a couple of $1,000, into a new, private savings account I had recently started. Funds I had left untouched, out of some vague, outdated sense of brotherly loyalty. Then I called the bank and closed the joint line of credit entirely, permanently. The next morning, Mason called me 4 times in a row, his impatience escalating with each unanswered ring. When I finally picked up on the 5th call, his voice was frantic, tinged with a desperate edge.
What did you do?
I didn't say anything, letting the question hang. Bro, I have a date with Brooke tonight. I was going to take her to that new place she likes.
And my card's bouncing.
It says the account doesn't exist. His voice rose in pitch, bordering on a wail. I know, I said, my voice calm, almost detached. I closed it.
What?
You can't just. I can, I interrupted, cutting him off with surgical precision. I can, and I did. You told me I wasn't family, remember? You don't get to use my money if I'm not even allowed at the table. He stammered for a second, caught off guard. Then, true to form, switched tactics, pivoting to his usual emotional manipulation. Come on, man. Don't do this. You're jealous. Admit it. You've always hated that I got the attention. Now you're just throwing a tantrum because Brooke's dad took my side. I laughed. Actually, truly laughed, a genuine, unburdened sound that surprised even myself. Oh, Mason, I said, the amusement evident in my voice. You really think he's on your side? There was a silence, longer this time, as the implications of my words sank in. Then I added, my voice softening, almost mockingly empathetic. Don't worry, man, you'll figure something out. You always do. Maybe ask Mom to open another line of credit in your name again. Or maybe Brooke's dad can teach you how to stand on your own 2 feet for once. And I hung up. I don't know what Mason did immediately after that call. But a few hours later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't from him. It was an email from Brooke. The subject line, I think we need to talk. I stared at Brooke's email for a long while before opening it. The subject line, a clear precursor to something monumental, something I wasn't entirely sure I was ready to face. But a potent mix of curiosity and a strange, dawning sense of impending closure pushed me to click it open. It was longer than I expected, far more detailed than any text or brief call. The tone was polite, yet deeply personal, formal in its structure, yet laced with the raw vulnerability of someone who was clearly unraveling, grappling with profound realizations. She started by unequivocally stating that she understood how incredibly awkward and humiliating the dinner had been. She admitted, with stark honesty, that she hadn't fully grasped the extent of how I had been treated until the entire farce came crashing down around them. I was so caught up in planning the perfect night, the perfect engagement celebration. She wrote, a clear note of regret in her words. I didn't stop to see the full picture, to really understand what was happening beneath the surface. But her father, she reiterated, had been absolutely furious. Furious not just because of the blatant financial deception, but because of the fundamental principle of it all, the utter lack of respect shown. He said, if they can publicly humiliate someone who financially and emotionally supported the entire night. She continued, her words echoing her father's indignation, then I need to seriously reconsider who I'm marrying into. Brooke, it seemed, wasn't one to mince words. She revealed that Mason had initially downplayed everything, brushing it off as a minor misunderstanding and a lie being dramatic. But once her dad, with his shrewd business acumen, demanded and received screenshots of the restaurant invoice, and then further requested a detailed breakdown from the manager, the carefully constructed lies began to crack, then shatter. Mason had fed her a convoluted story that I had insisted on paying, that I didn't want to sit at the main table because I was introverted and preferred quiet, and that I had left early because I had an unexpected work emergency. But once I talked to the waiter myself, she wrote, her honesty stark and refreshing. Yes, a lie, I called the restaurant, and he told me everything. The story fell apart completely. Then came the part I truly didn't expect, the words that made me blink, then reread them several times to ensure my eyes weren't deceiving me. I ended the engagement last night. She explained that it wasn't just the dinner, not simply that singular egregious act. The entire situation had served as a harsh, unyielding spotlight, pulling back the curtain on a pattern of behaviors she had previously excused, minimized, or simply not seen in Mason. The casual entitlement, the way he spoke about me behind my back with dismissive disdain, the way her own concerns were constantly trivialized and minimized by him. He kept saying you were overreacting, that you always do. She wrote, her tone laced with a newfound clarity. But honestly, you're the only one who reacted with any dignity, any integrity throughout this entire mess. She ended the email with a short, poignant note. I'm not writing this to pit myself against Mason or to drag you further into drama. I just wanted you to know. I see it now, and I'm sorry, truly sorry that I didn't see it sooner. I sat there for a long, quiet time, rereading her email. Not because I didn't believe her words, but because I wasn't used to being believed. Not by my family, not in this profound, validating way. It was a strange, powerful sensation, like breathing clear air for the first time after years of suffocation. The next few weeks were oddly quiet, a surreal stillness descending after the preceding storm. The family group chat, once a hive of frantic activity, died out completely, a digital graveyard. Mason tried calling twice more, his numbers blocked, his messages ignored. After no response, he finally stopped. I learned through the grapevine, courtesy of Trent, that he had, predictably, moved back in with our parents, the golden child once again seeking refuge in the gilded cage of their protection. Brooke, true to her word, returned the engagement ring. Her father, a man of his word, sent out official cancellation notices to the wedding venue and all the various vendors. A few of Mason's old friends, the hangers-on, seemed to drop off the map entirely, apparently having only been riding his coattails to gain access to Brooke's prestigious connections and her father's substantial influence. I thought that would be it, that the turbulence would simply settle into a profound, lasting silence. But then, one quiet Sunday morning, there was a tentative knock on my door. It was my mom. She stood on my front porch, bundled in a long, worn cardigan, clutching a Tupperware container of homemade lasagna like it was a peace offering, a culinary olive branch. Her eyes were puffy, betraying nights of sleepless worry, and her makeup was thin, streaked in places, a stark contrast to her usual polished facade. I didn't say anything. I simply opened the door a crack and waited, letting the silence hang heavy between us. I brought you dinner, she said, her voice small, almost hesitant. I didn't reach for it, didn't acknowledge the offering. I just continued to watch her. I just wanted to talk. No excuses. That part, specifically, genuinely surprised me. No excuses. It was a departure from her well-practiced script. I opened the door wider and let her in. She sat at my kitchen table, the same way she used to when I was a child, her fingers nervously picking at a loose thread on her cardigan. The same forced, strained smile pasted on her lips, but this time there was no passive aggressiveness, no thinly veiled barbs. No, you're just tired. Eli. No, he didn't mean it, you know. She cleared her throat, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. I owe you an apology, she began, her voice barely a whisper. I crossed my arms, maintaining my guarded stance. Just one, I prompted, my voice calm, but with an edge of quiet challenge. Her face tightened for a brief moment, a flicker of her old self, but then she nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Fair, she conceded, the word heavy with implication. Probably more than one. She took a deep, shaky breath, gathering her courage. I didn't see it. Not because it wasn't there, not because you didn't try to show us, but because I didn't want to see it. Mason's always been loud, Eli. He takes up so much space, demands so much attention. And you never asked for anything. You just did. You handled things. You showed up always. I guess we started treating you like a safety net. Something we just assumed would always be there, reliably waiting to catch us whenever we stumbled. That's the thing about safety nets, Mom, I said, my voice low, filled with years of unspoken observations. People only look at them when they're falling, never when they're climbing. Her lip trembled, a delicate tremor of raw emotion. She looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, unable to meet my gaze. Your father and I were wrong, Eli. So profoundly wrong. We let Mason get away with too much. We let him treat you like less. Like you didn't matter as much. I stayed quiet, letting her words hang in the air, a belated confession. I know I can't undo that. She continued, her voice thick with unshed tears. I know a Tupperware of Lagna and a single I'm sorry won't fix years of imbalance, years of neglect. But I just wanted you to know that I see it now. And I'm sorry, truly sorry. I watched her for a long moment, truly watched her. For the first time in my entire life, she wasn't dodging or deflecting. She wasn't defending Mason. She wasn't telling me to lower my voice or to get over it. She was just sitting there owning it. Owning her part in the systemic neglect, the quiet cruelty. I nodded slowly, a small, tentative acknowledgement. Thank you, Mom. We didn't talk for long after that, the raw emotion of the moment too potent to sustain extended conversation. She left the lasagna a tangible, if belated, offering of remorse. I walked her to the door. She didn't ask me to forgive Mason. She didn't ask me to call him. She simply said, "Take care of yourself, Eli," her voice soft, almost fragile, and then she drove off. After that, things didn't magically repair themselves overnight. The deep fissures carved by years of imbalance remained. But things didn't get worse either. My parents started sending individual messages instead of mass group texts, short ones, respectful ones, almost tentative in their approach. My mom even invited me to Thanksgiving in a few months, adding, "Only if you feel up to it." A respectful deferral to my boundaries. I haven't decided if I'll go. Mason, from what I hear through the now very thin grapevine, is back to working part-time at some obscure startup he evidently hates, still living rent-free, probably avoiding eye contact with his own reflection. He hasn't reached out again. And I'm okay with that. More than okay. As for me, I started doing more with my time, not just for others, but for myself. I finally took that long postponed trip to Spain, immersing myself in new cultures, new experiences, new ways of seeing the world. I bought myself a brand new set of noise-canceling headphones, a symbolic gesture of reclaiming my own quiet space, silencing the external noise. I read books on boundaries, on healthy family dynamics, on the profound power of quiet strength. I even started seeing a therapist, not because I felt broken or damaged beyond repair, but because I realized that true healing doesn't come from passively waiting for someone else to finally utter the word, sorry. It comes when you look at your own reflection, truly see yourself, and with a quiet, resolute conviction say, you deserved better, and you finally gave it to yourself. So no, I didn't pay the bill that night. But in that decisive moment, I finally cashed in years, decades even of silent, emotional debt. And for the very first time in my life, I'm not sitting next to the trash can, relegated to the periphery. I'm at my own table. And that table, finally, is more than enough. It is everything.